Last time we finally added obstacles to our game, so now whenever we bump into one of these cubes in our scene, we actually stop our player's movement, which is great, but there's still quite a few things that need to be done to turn this into an actual game. One of the most important parts of making a game is making it look and feel good, and that doesn't always mean making a AAA game or making perfect controls, but we want to adjust this to make it look and feel better so that the game is actually enjoyable to the player. Alright, so right away, if we look at our scene here, and even if we play, things are looking a little bit bland. To fix this, one of the first things I want to do is add a sky sphere. And we had that before. We can look in here over on the Place Actors panel here. We have BP Sky Sphere here, and we could bring this in. And we could use this if we wanted to go for more of a realistic or even cartoony look. I think I want to go with something a little bit more simplistic. We can go ahead and get rid of the sky sphere here, and instead, we're going to create our own sky sphere. And to do this, we're going to just drag in a sphere over here from Place Actors and drop this in. I'm going to set its location to 0, 0, 0, and I'm also going to scale it up to something like 5,000 on each axis. But the problem is we can't see it. We're not seeing anything. It looks like there's nothing there. And that's because we're seeing the inside of the sphere, which was actually never modeled. And normally what this would require is opening up a 3D modeling application and inverting the normals. But thankfully in Unreal, we already have an inverted normal sphere by default. But if you try to change this static mesh over here in the details, you'll notice that there are no models to choose from. And to fix this, you can come down here to View Options. You can also do this in the content browser. And all we need to do is find Show Engine Content. And as soon as we enable this and we click this little drop down again, there's a bunch of things here. And right underneath Sphere, there's Sphere _ inverse normals. And that's exactly what we want. If we click on this, you'll see immediately we see the inside of the sphere now. But there are still a few problems here. First of all, it doesn't look great. But also if we try to play, we just kind of go all over the place, and that's not what we want. So we're going to go ahead and select our sphere here. I'm going to rename this to Sky, and we're going to come over here to the details panel and look for collision. We're going to change two things here. Only one of them is necessary, but I'm going to change this one anyways. Can character step up on is basically asking whether or not the character should be able to treat this object as if it's a stair or a slope, and we don't want that, but it doesn't matter because this isn't actually technically a character. It's just an actor, so it doesn't matter, but we're going to change this to no anyways. And then under collision presets, we're going to change this to no collision because we don't want this sphere to have any collision whatsoever. And now if we play, everything's back to normal. But this still doesn't look super great. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come down here to our content browser, right click, and create a material. We're going to call this m_sky, open that up, and this material is definitely going to be a little bit different than the previous materials. First thing we're going to do is select this little result node here, and we're going to change a few details on the left over here. We don't want this material to react to lighting because we want this to kind of just be a background object. So we're going to come over here to our shading model under material and change this from default lit to unlit. And now you can see a bunch of pins have been grayed out here, and there are a few different options, but all we care about is the emissive color, otherwise known as the glow. I'm going to create a constant vector 3 by holding 3 and left clicking. You can also look for constant 3 vector, and I'm going to give this a light gray, almost white value. I think that's nice. Hit OK there, and then I'm going to connect this pin over to the emissive color here. So let's apply it and let it do its thing. We can now close this material, and now we're going to apply our new sky material to our sky sphere. I can just go ahead and drag and drop this on here, and that looks much better. And if we play, this looks like it fits the world a lot better than it did before. Now we can go ahead and start actually designing some levels. To do that, let's just go ahead and zoom out a ways here, and we're going to move our little ground plane here until our ground plane is sitting right at the edge of the camera here. We can even extend this out a little bit more to maybe something like 5,000. We can also come over here to location under the transform and just slide this value up. That'll give us a little bit more precise movement. So I think it's just better to zoom out a ways and grab the little red arrow and move it wherever we'd like. But it can also be a little bit slow to get all the way out there. So we can come over here to the top right in our viewport and change our camera speed up to something like 8. And now we'll be zooming way off into the distance, and we can now adjust this accordingly. We can then zoom back in to where everything is in the scene and change this value back down to 4 to have a little bit more precise camera movement. And there we go. Now our ground plane here kind of goes off into the distance seemingly forever. And now we actually need to just place these objects in our scene, and we could just grab these and adjust them a little bit here and there and make it fit better and design the level like this, or we could use our perspective modes to our advantage. Now, unlike in Unity, we actually have a little drop down for all these different options here instead of just having a little gizmo in the top right hand corner. So we're going to change from perspective over here in perspective mode to, say, top down mode, and it'll immediately change us into a different view mode here, like for me, brush wireframe. And this is not the view that I want to be seeing. I want to see either lit or unlit view of this scene. So we can come up here and change this to lit, and that looks fine. We can also change it to unlit so everything looks flat, and that's okay too. And now we can of course click on everything in our scene here and just adjust it as we would like. We can zoom in and out, we can move by holding down the right mouse button, and everything else acts like normal except there's no Z axis. It's just X and Y. We could of course go into, say, left view mode as well, or right view mode to see this scene this way. You could adjust things for like a 2D game. We're gonna stick with top mode here so we can adjust this level and just kind of mess around with some scaling of these obstacles here. Now what I want to do here is just find the edge of the plane here, snap it in place, and I want to change the movement snapping to 100. So now if I were to duplicate this cube, they'll be sitting right next to each other, and I could keep doing this and it would just form a wall. Obviously it's probably much smarter to just scale this up to something like 10 if I wanted to do that instead of placing 10 blocks, but either way, having it snapped at 100 just feels easier to move around, and it'll snap into place better while I'm trying to edit this scene. And there we go. Obviously this isn't the greatest level in the world, but I think it works for what we're trying to do here. We can go ahead and come back to our perspective mode, and now if we were to play with this, everything would work just fine, but it also is a little bit difficult, and it kind of feels like our controls are a little bit floaty. So we're gonna mess with our player controls here. Of course, we could just come over here and adjust our forward force and our sideways force a bit, but I think one thing that's happening is it's a little bit too slippery. So that isn't 100% just our controls being not fine-tuned well enough. It's also a matter of the physics object's amount of drag. So we can go ahead and open up our blueprint here so we can find our static mesh here. Go ahead and scroll down to physics here, and we have two options for dampening, linear dampening and angular dampening. And if you hover over either of these, they have a little tooltip calling it drag. And drag force you can imagine as if somebody were pulling on this static mesh as it's moving to slow it down. And angular dampening, it does the same thing just with rotation. So our linear dampening we're going to set to 1, and we're going to set our angular dampening to 1 as well. We won't really be able to see this one much, at least not right now, but the linear dampening will definitely be able to tell a difference. You can mess with these values as much as you'd like. These are just the two values that I came up with that I think fit best for this scenario. Go ahead and compile that and close this blueprint. And now if we hit play, we're going to be moving a lot slower. And if we bump into an object, we're not going to rotate nearly as much. So that just means we need to speed up our character a little bit. So we can increase this forward force to something like 80, and we're going to change our sideways force to something like 250. I said I was probably going to increase this to something like 100 earlier, but looking at my previous project files for this, 250 seems to be the way to go. Our level does still feel a little bit too difficult, so we can come back over here into top-down view, and we're just going to spread these things out a little bit. You can just click and drag and highlight over everything to select things, but always make sure to hold Control and left click on your sky and your floor to deselect them before you continue. There we go. That looks a lot better. And I do feel like our sideways movement here is a little bit too much. I might want to decrease this to something like 100. And also it feels like our player isn't moving super fast. So I might increase the forward force to something like 100 and decrease the sideways force to something like 200. That feels much better. And of course you can play with all these values as much as you'd like to make it fit best for your game, but that works for me. And yet now, if we were to zoom out a ways, if we get to a certain point, you'll start to see outside of this sphere again. again, and we don't want that. So if we had a really long level and we somehow managed to make it all the way outside of this sphere here, we would start to see the outside world, and that's not what we want. So to fix this, we're just going to change our sky's movability to movable, and then drag and drop our sky onto our player. And now the sky will always be moving with the player, so the player will never be able to get outside of this sphere. And the last thing I want to do here is adjust the way that our level is revealed. Right now, we can kind of see every obstacle melding together in the distance, and I don't really like that. I think it should be kind of revealed slightly as we go. And I think the best way to do this is by adding volumetric fog. Volumetric fog is definitely worthy of its own video because of how complicated it can get in terms of lighting with the Unreal Engine. But for right now, we're just going to mess with a few values to change a few things here and give you something to play with. First of all, how do we enable volumetric fog in our scene? Well, we need to come over here to the left under Place Actors, Visual Effects, and drag in Exponential Height Fog. And as soon as we drop this in, you'll see there's a little bit of a blue tint, and maybe you like that. I'm not a huge fan of it. I think keeping the skybox white looks better. So we can come over here to the right under Fog in Scattering Color. We can change this to just a white color. That's fine. We could also adjust this to make it black if we wanted to. Then we need to come down here to Volumetric Fog and enable this volumetric fog. You won't notice much of a difference right away. The scene does get a little bit darker, but aside from that, it doesn't look all that much different. And that's because our fog density is pretty low right now. I'm going to increase this to something like 0.2. There we go. I think that looks a lot nicer. You can of course mess with these values as much as you'd like. If I were to bump this up to something like 0.5, you can see the fog gets really thick, but I think 0.2 is nice for now. Of course, there are a lot of other values over here to mess with, and that's why I say that I think volumetric fog or fog as a whole is something for its own separate video, but you can mess with these values if you would like to. And now as we play through our level here, you can see it looks like the level's getting slightly revealed as time goes on, and I feel like that looks a lot nicer. Obviously, when we bump into objects, we're still not restarting the level, and there is still no win state, and if we fall off the level, we're still not dying. But there's still one other thing that I'd like to tackle before we start messing with game overs and win states. That is the score and UI, but we'll get into that in the next video. I think that does it for this video. We have a nice little scene set up now, and we've got a little bit of a long level. We might want to shorten this later and mess with the way that it's laid out, but of course you can play with this and create as many different levels or as long of a level as you would like. That's going to do it for this video. Next time we'll be adding a score and working on a little bit of UI before we actually worry about game overs and winning states, but don't worry, we'll get there soon enough. Remember, if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments below, and I will try to answer them as soon as I possibly can. Thank you guys for the incredible support you guys have given me throughout this series, and I hope to see you in the next video.